The garden smelled of roses that evening, but to me the air felt sharp, almost metallic, as if the flowers had soaked up cruelty instead of sunlight. My sister Sophia stood near the largest rose bush, her dress spotless white, her manicured nails playing with one of the stems as if it were a toy meant only for her. She had that smile on her face again, the one she wore when she wanted me to feel small. I was only a few steps away holding a basket of tools when she turned and her voice carried like a knife. "Do not touch the roses," she hissed. "They are too beautiful for someone like you." My chest tightened, but I answered, tired of swallowing every insult. "They are just flowers, Sophia, not your trophies." That was when the moment cracked open. She yanked the branch with her hand, ignoring the thorns that scratched her own skin, and in one sweeping motion she slashed it across my cheek. I gasped as fire spread from the cut, my face stinging my body, stumbling backward. The blood was warm and sudden, sliding down toward my jaw. Before I could catch my breath, she struck again, this time across my arm, leaving thin red lines like burning wires. Her laughter filled the air, not the laugh of joy, but of triumph. It rang out like a bell meant to humiliate me, a bell that told me and the world that she was untouchable. "Beautiful things hurt trash," she sneered, her eyes flashing with pleasure as the thorned branch moved again. I raised my hands in defense, but she shoved me down onto the dirt. The ground was cold, the petals scattered around me looked like drops of crimson fire, and I tasted grit on my tongue as her laughter pressed me further into the earth. Then the door creaked behind us. I thought maybe for once my mother would stop it. Margaret stepped out onto the porch, a glass in her hand, her eyes fixed on us as if she had been waiting for this show. She leaned against the railing and her lips curved in a smirk. "Go on, Sophia," she called. "Teach her what beauty really costs. Ugly girls always pay more." My stomach dropped lower than the soil beneath me. Mother was not coming to help. She was there to cheer the blows. Sophia's laughter grew louder, emboldened, and she dragged the branch again across my shoulder, leaving another burning stripe. I cried out, my voice breaking, but it only brought another cruel sound from behind me. "Keep it down out there," Richard shouted from inside. "If she is crying, she probably deserves it. Do not interrupt my show." My father's voice was thick with irritation, not concern, as if my pain was only background noise interrupting his evening. Humiliation crushed me harder than the blows. The roses swayed in the wind like silent witnesses, their beauty mocking me. Neighbors glanced through the fences. I saw one pair of eyes flicker, then vanished, the wooden slats closing like a curtain. No one ever interfered. The world shrank to Sophia's cruel grin, to my mother's smirk, to my father's indifference. The thorned branch fell at last from her hand, her chest rising and falling quickly, her eyes sparkling with the thrill of power. She leaned close, her perfume mixing with the metallic scent of blood, and whispered near my ear, "Remember, this beauty cuts, and you will never have it." Behind her, my mother clapped slowly, the sound deliberate like applause at a theater. "Well done! Maybe she will finally learn her place." I trembled, my face wet with tears and blood, my dignity shredded like the petals around me. I wanted to scream, to strike back, but silence trapped me. It had trapped me for years, and tonight it felt like a coffin. Yet even in that coffin, something shifted. Humiliation pressed me into the ground, but inside, somewhere deep, a spark lit. While they laughed, I memorized every word, every smirk, every cruel glance. My mother's glass catching the light, my father's dismissive tone, my sister's triumph. I recorded it all in the hidden pages of my mind. I whispered without moving my lips, "One day your laughter will end, and when it does, it will not be me crying. It will be you." I staggered to my feet, blood drying against my cheek, and walked inside without a word. My legs shook, but I refused to collapse. Upstairs in my room, I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The cut stretched angry and red across my face, a jagged reminder. My arms burned with shallow wounds. But worse than the pain was the echo Sophia's words, my mother's approval, my father's scorn. "Beautiful things hurt trash. You will never bloom." The words repeated until they filled the room, until they pressed against me like the thorns had pressed against my skin. I closed my eyes, but they carved themselves deeper. When I opened them again, I looked at my reflection differently. The blood, the tear streaks the hollow stare. It was not just weakness anymore. It was evidence, evidence of who they were, evidence of what they had made me carry. I leaned closer to the mirror, whispering to myself, "This is not the end. This is the mark that begins it all." The laughter still rang downstairs, faint but sharp, and I sat alone with the echo of cruelty. But even in that echo, my vow grew louder. They thought tonight was their victory, but tonight was the first stone in the wall of their downfall. The roses outside the window swayed again, but this time I saw not beauty or humiliation. I saw weapons. I saw symbols. And I saw a future where I would no longer be their shadow. Sophia Dawson was born 4 years before me, and from the very beginning she was treated like a crown jewel that everyone else in the family existed to polish. I grew up watching her wrapped in compliments while I was wrapped in silence. The first memory that sticks in my chest like a splinter is a birthday when I was 6 and she was 10. She blew out candles on a cake taller than my head gifts, stacked so high they looked like towers. When it was my turn, weeks later, I received a cupcake with 1 candle and a sweater that was 2 sizes too large. Margaret. My mother smiled with that distant expression, saying money was tight, but when Sophia needed new dresses for school parties, money appeared like magic. That was the shape of my childhood, a set of rules bent only for her. Sophia's grades were rarely good. She would bring home test papers stained with red marks, and instead of scolding her, Margaret would stroke her hair and sigh. "She is too beautiful to worry about grades." Richard, my father, would nod, pouring another drink, muttering about how brains were overrated and beauty opened doors. I remember sitting at the same table with my straight A report card clenched in my hands, expecting maybe a fraction of praise. Instead, Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Stop trying to show off Claire. No one likes a desperate girl." Richard chuckled as if that remark were wisdom. The paper in my hands blurred as tears welled, and that was when I first understood that achievement meant nothing in our house if it did not belong to Sophia. Every family dinner became a stage where I was forced into the role of the unwanted extra. Sophia would recount her day embellishing stories about boys who noticed her girls, who envied her teachers, who forgave her. My parents listened with glowing faces, clinking their glasses to her future. When I tried to mention winning a science competition, Margaret waved her hand. "Do not bore us, Claire. Eat your food." Richard grunted that I should not act superior. The sting of dismissal became routine, but it never dulled. Outside, the pattern continued. Neighbors adored Sophia, dazzled by her confidence and bright smile. They would pat her head, calling her a future star, while barely acknowledging me standing next to her. At school, teachers gave her second chances, excused her late homework, forgave her careless behavior. Sometimes simply because she batted her lashes. When I sat quietly focused, delivering perfect work, I was labeled cold, too intense, or just overlooked entirely. The bitterness built in layers like sediment in a river, heavy and suffocating. Margaret often compared us directly, a dagger hidden in motherly tone. "Sophia has a glow, Claire. People are drawn to her. You should try to be less serious, less yourself." Richard would laugh, claiming he needed no second daughter because 1 star in the family was enough. He liked to say it in front of guests, turning my existence into a punchline. I would sit still, cheeks burning, swallowing every protest because I knew what would happen if I spoke. Their eyes would harden and the punishment would come later, words slicing sharper than thorns. Even when Sophia messed up in ways that cost money, like her shopping sprees or her late-night taxi rides home from parties, the reaction was indulgence. "She deserves it." Margaret would say she has to look good. Richard would agree, muttering something about investments. When I saved money from part-time jobs, working long hours, stocking shelves at a local store, they asked why I bothered. "You will never shine, no matter what you buy," my mother said one evening, sipping her wine. The words slid into me like poison, and I could not help but believe them for a time. The house itself reflected the hierarchy. Sophia's room was bright, freshly painted, filled with new furniture, a canopy bed draped with silk. My room was the attic space cramped with peeling wallpaper and a single dim lamp. Whenever I complained, Richard barked that I should be grateful to have a roof. Margaret would add that a pretty room would not make me pretty. That line lodged deep echoing every time I crossed the threshold of my space. I began to associate walls and ceilings with shame. Sophia mastered cruelty not just in words but in small acts. She would borrow my clothes without asking stain them and then laugh in my face when I begged for them back. Once she cut the laces off my sneakers and told our parents I was careless. They believed her, instantly scolding me for being irresponsible. Every injustice piled up, and I felt bitterness like a permanent bruise under my skin. When you live as the scapegoat, even air tastes different, heavier, carrying the weight of blame. Margaret and Richard's favoritism shaped the way extended family treated us as well. At gatherings, Sophia was paraded in front of relatives introduced as the pride of the Dawson family. I was introduced as the other daughter, usually followed by a sigh. Aunts and uncles slipped money into Sophia's hand, promising to support her dreams. I stood aside with a forced smile, clutching my empty hands, pretending not to care. Inside, a sourness grew that was almost unbearable. I learned early that even pain became a spectacle in our house. When I once broke my wrist falling from a bike, Richard accused me of being clumsy. Margaret barely looked up from her magazine. Sophia mocked me for weeks, imitating the way I had cried. When she sprained her ankle at a dance, the whole household revolved around her recovery. She received flowers, attention-warm meals in bed. I watched wrist-in-plaster bitterness hardening like stone. Bitterness is not always loud. Most days it was silent and ache that accompanied me from sunrise to sleep. Yet silence recorded everything. Every smile Sophia stole, every glance of approval she received, every dismissal I endured. That silence became a ledger in my mind, each entry written in invisible ink, but never forgotten. It was the only power I held, the power to remember to collect every wound, until the day came when memory would be heavier than their denial. Looking back, I understand how deep those years carved me. I was not simply ignored. I was erased in slow motion, scrubbed from my own family narrative while Sophia's name was engraved in gold. The bitterness of being told you do not matter seeps into your bones, and once it settles, it never fully leaves. I wore it like a second skin, invisible to others, but suffocating to me. By the time I reached 20, the pattern was unshakable. Sophia was praised for breathing, and I was punished for existing. Margaret and Richard had perfected the art of making me doubt every accomplishment, every attempt to be seen. My bitterness was no longer just sadness. It was rage, pressed flat, hidden under years of silence. And deep inside, I began to sense that one day it would no longer stay hidden. Humiliation has a way of clinging to the skin more tightly than sweat, more permanently than scars. By the time I was in my early 20s, it had become the daily language of my family. Sophia had perfected her role as the golden daughter, while I remained the backdrop against which her brilliance could shine brighter. Each insult carried weight, but when combined, they created a world where I was forced to bow lower each day. It was not enough that I was ignored. I had to be crushed publicly to remind everyone of my supposed place. Sophia's cruelty was no longer confined to whispers at the dinner table or quiet sabotage. She grew bolder, sharper, and her audience was always ready. One evening after dinner, she stood in front of me holding one of her prized roses. The thorns glistened in the dim kitchen light. She pressed it into my arm with deliberate slowness, not enough to cut deeply, but enough to make me wince. Margaret sipped her coffee without looking up, and her lips curled with amusement. "Scars build character," she said casually, as if we were discussing weather. Richard, reading the paper, grunted his agreement. I bit my tongue until it bled humiliation, burning hotter than the shallow cuts. The memory of that night stayed with me, but worse followed. Sophia developed a habit of using her roses as weapons, a symbol of her dominance. When I tried to study at the desk in my room, she would storm in without knocking, slam the branch against the wood, scattering my books. "Still pretending you are better than me with your studying," she taunted, her voice dripping with venom. "Guess what? No one will care about your grades. You will always be the ugly shadow." My pulse would race, my hands trembling as I scrambled to pick up the fallen books. Margaret often appeared in the doorway during these confrontations, leaning against the frame with a knowing smirk. "Do not waste too much time, Sophia," she would say. "Trash learns slow, but sometimes you have to beat the lesson into them." The words carved into me more deeply than the thorns. Every strike, every shove was made worse by the presence of those who should have defended me. Father's dismissive voice from the living room was routine. "If she is crying, she deserves it. Do not interrupt my show." My pain was entertainment, and my humiliation was the background music of his evenings. I was not a daughter. I was an interruption, an object of disdain. And every time the humiliation unfolded, I could feel the world around me shrinking, suffocating me into silence. Sophia's attacks escalated in front of neighbors, too. In the garden one weekend, she grabbed a rose branch and dragged it across my arm, while Margaret laughed from the porch. A neighbor across the fence peeked out, their face pale, their mouth opening as if to say something, but then they turned away, quickly disappearing into their house. That was worse than the strike itself, knowing that even outsiders saw me as someone not worth saving. Humiliation expanded from the home into the entire street, branding me in ways that no one would ever acknowledge. The worst night came when Sophia lashed out with such force that the branch slashed across my cheek, leaving a jagged line of blood. My mother clapped slowly and deliberately, her eyes shining as if she were witnessing a performance worth applause. "Well done, Sophia. Maybe she will finally learn her place." My face burned tears mixing with blood, but the shame was hotter. I stumbled to the mirror in the bathroom, staring at the ugly wound stretching across my skin. For a moment, I wished I could disappear, completely erase myself the way they had been trying to erase me for years. The reflection staring back was one I almost did not recognize, defeated, humiliated, erased. That humiliation dug deeper when Sophia came into my room later that night. She stood by the doorway, arms crossed, smirk wide. "Does it still sting, Claire, or have you finally learned where you belong?" I could not answer. I just sat on the bed silent, my cheek throbbing, my dignity bleeding in visible rivers. Margaret's voice floated from down the hall, loud enough for me to hear. "If she has not learned, Sophia, maybe next time across her face will do it." Her laughter followed like nails across glass. The humiliation was designed to break me, and for a long time it worked. I stopped speaking during family dinners, afraid every word would turn into another weapon against me. At school, I covered my scratches with makeup, lying about accidents in the garden. When my friend Jessica once noticed the marks on my arm, I muttered about clumsiness, refusing to admit the truth. How could I? Admitting meant confirming I was the family punching bag. Admitting meant accepting that no one would believe me, or worse, that they would pity me. Pity was another form of humiliation I could not bear. Yet the cruelest part of humiliation is the echo it leaves. Long after the cuts healed, I would hear Sophia's laughter in my sleep. I would hear my mother's slow clap. I would see my father's face glowing with the light of his television, unconcerned. Even in solitude, humiliation lingered like a shadow. I could not escape it because it had been etched into every corner of my world. But humiliation is not simply a weight. It is also a seed. Every insult, every strike, every laugh pressed me closer to the ground, but also pressed a seed deeper into the soil of my soul. It waited there, buried under layers of shame and silence, ready to grow into something stronger. I did not recognize it at the time. All I felt was the sting, the shame, the burning humiliation that seemed endless, but inside, quietly, something else was beginning to take shape. Still in those days, humiliation defined me. I was the daughter who cried in silence, the sister who wore scratches like invisible tattoos, the girl who sat in classrooms pretending not to exist. Each humiliation was a brick in the wall they built around me, a wall meant to keep me small, to keep me convinced I was nothing. And I carried that wall on my shoulders, heavy, unshakable, everywhere I went. When I look back now, I see those years for what they were, the forging ground of my strength. But living them moment by moment felt like drowning in an endless tide of humiliation. I breathed it, I ate it, I slept in it, and worst of all, I believed it. The night after Sophia cut my cheek, I sat at my desk staring at the dim lamplight flickering across my books. The sting of the wound pulsed with every beat of my heart, but the deeper pain was still the echo of her words. "Does it still sting, Claire, or have you finally learned where you belong?" I replayed it again and again, the cruelty in her tone, the smirk in her eyes, my mother's approving voice down the hall. Normally, humiliation would press me into silence until morning, but that night, something shifted. I looked at the blood drying along the cut and realized it was more than a wound. It was a mark, a reminder. And a reminder can become a reason. When Sophia confronted me the next morning in the kitchen twirling another rose stem like a queen with her scepter, I expected the same routine. She tapped the branch against her palm and sneered. "Well, little sister, are you finally quiet enough to stay invisible?" Margaret sat at the table scrolling through her phone, not even lifting her eyes, murmuring, "If she has not learned, maybe across her face again will help." My cereal sat untouched in front of me, the milk growing warm. Normally, I would have lowered my eyes, hidden my trembling hands under the table. But this time, I lifted my gaze. I looked directly into Sophia's eyes. The silence stretched. For a brief second, her smirk faltered. I saw the flicker of doubt. Then she laughed, brushing it away, pretending she was not unsettled. But I felt it. For the first time, she had seen something she could not name in me. That was the spark. I did not need to scream or argue. I only needed to let her see that I was no longer entirely broken. Silence had always been my prison, but now it became my weapon. The rest of that day, I carried a strange sense of power inside me, fragile but real. Every time Sophia insulted me, I did not flinch. Every time Margaret dismissed me, I nodded, storing the words like notes in a ledger. Richard barked from his chair, his eyes never leaving the television, and I simply listened silent, unmoving. They thought my silence was submission, but in truth, I had begun planning. Silence was no longer weakness, it was strategy. At school, I started to see myself differently. Jessica, the one friend who ever truly noticed me, leaned over one afternoon when she saw me rubbing my arm. "What happened to you this time?" she whispered. I gave my usual excuse about gardening, but inside, I thought one day I will not have to lie. One day, someone will see the truth with their own eyes. Jessica studied me for a moment, her brows furrowed, and then she said softly, "You deserve better, Claire. And one day, they will see it." I carried that sentence with me like a talisman. That night, I stood in the garden long after everyone had gone to bed. The roses swayed under the moonlight, the same bush Sophia had torn her branch from. I stretched out my hand, hovering it over the thorns, but did not touch them. Instead, I whispered into the night, "One day you will feel what I feel. Every cut, every sting." The words hung in the air like a promise. I felt hope stir, fragile but undeniable, rising above the bitterness. From then on, I began to practice in small ways. When Sophia stormed into my room and tried to scatter my books, I let her then calmly picked them up without a word. She wanted my tears, my panic, my protests, but I gave her nothing. That unsettled her more than any scream could have. Margaret noticed too. She muttered to Richard one evening, "Something is off with her. She is too quiet." Richard barely looked away from the screen, grunting that quiet was finally discipline working. They did not realize quiet was the birth of resistance. Each night in my attic room, I wrote small notes to myself, words I dared not speak aloud. Notes like, "Remember how they laughed. Remember how it felt. Remember to make them regret." I tucked the notes between the pages of my books, a secret record of my vow. The act of writing gave me strength. It was proof that my mind remained my own, untouched by their gaslighting. I also started to prepare in practical ways. I worked extra shifts at the store, sliding money into a hidden envelope. It was not much, but it was mine. Each dollar was a brick in the foundation of the life I would one day build. I researched apartments in the city, scribbling addresses in my notebook. The very act of imagining escape filled me with hope, a hope that tasted almost dangerous after years of despair. Sophia sensed something had changed, even if she could not name it. One afternoon, she grabbed my arm, forcing my sleeve up to look at fading scratches. "Still hiding your shame," she taunted. I looked at her without blinking. Something in my eyes made her release me quickly, brushing it off with a laugh, but her voice cracked just slightly. That crack was enough to fuel me for weeks. Hope is not always bright or loud. Sometimes it is quiet like a coal glowing under ash. That was what I carried inside me. It did not erase the pain. It did not stop the insults or the blows. But it gave me a center, a core they could not reach. And from that core, I began to grow in ways they could not see. Every humiliation became data. Every insult became evidence. I memorized their patterns, their words, their weaknesses. The way Margaret always needed others to admire her diamonds, the way Richard craved respect in the neighborhood, the way Sophia needed attention like oxygen. Each observation was stored carefully, not out of bitterness alone, but as preparation. My spark of resistance was hope, but my hope was sharpened by purpose. When I looked in the mirror at night, the scar across my cheek still red and angry, I no longer saw only shame. I saw a reminder that I had survived, a reminder that I could turn their cruelty into something else. I whispered to the reflection, "This is not the end. This is the beginning." And though no one else knew it, though my family still laughed and sneered, though neighbors still turned away, I carried within me a new truth. I would not be their victim forever. I would not be the silent scapegoat buried under their golden child. My silence was no longer a coffin. It was a seed. And seeds once planted do not stay buried. They rise. Determination does not arrive with fanfare. It creeps in quietly and then hardens into resolve until it becomes the backbone of every choice. After that spark in the kitchen, when Sophia faltered under my gaze, I knew silence would no longer be submission. It would be cover. My days began to split into two lives, one visible to them and one secret for myself. At home, I nodded when Margaret called me useless. I stayed silent when Richard barked that discipline was finally working, and I pretended to shrink when Sophia waved her roses like trophies. They believed they had broken me. In truth, I was building. Each insult became a stone I set into the foundation of escape. My first step was money. Working at the store was exhausting, but I pushed for extra shifts, stocking shelves until my arms ached, smiling at customers when inside I wanted to collapse. Every dollar I earned, I slid into an envelope hidden beneath a loose floorboard in my attic room. I touched it every night, whispering to myself that this was not just paper, it was freedom. Slowly, the envelope thickened, and with each added bill, my determination grew stronger. I began researching apartments in the city on the library computer. Cheap basement spaces with mold, tiny studios with cracked tiles, but all of them looked like palaces to me because they were mine in possibility. I copied addresses in my notebook, tracing the words like sacred lines. Even the act of writing them down gave me energy. The second step was education. My grades were strong, but I knew I needed more than report cards. While Sophia flaunted clothes and posted pictures online, I attended evening classes quietly. Computer skills project management certifications that promised entry into careers beyond the reach of my family's influence. I sat in classrooms with tired workers twice my age, people trying to build better futures, and for the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere. My determination sharpened with every certificate I earned, proof that I was not the nothing they said I was. At night, when the house was dark, I studied at my desk with the scar on my cheek still fresh, my lamp flickering. Each page of notes was like a brick in the wall between me and them. My scar itched, sometimes pulling when I smiled, but instead of shame, it became fuel. I looked at it in the mirror and thought, every mark you gave me will be turned against you. That thought hardened into a vow. Sophia continued to spiral, wasting money, skipping classes, chasing parties. Margaret defended her with endless excuses. She needs to look good. She is destined for greatness. Richard poured money into her messes, muttering about her future, as if saying it would make it real. Meanwhile, they hardly noticed my absence at meals, my hours at work, my nights away in classes. Their obsession with Sophia's glitter blinded them to the quiet determination growing under their roof. That blindness was my protection. Jessica became my quiet ally without even knowing all the details. She saw me studying in corners during breaks at the store, asked why I worked so hard, and I just shrugged. One evening, she said softly, "You are building something, I can see it." The words struck me because she was right. I did not tell her everything, but her recognition fueled me. It was the first time someone acknowledged the determination burning in me. Months passed, and the envelope under the floorboard grew fat enough that I dared to act. One Saturday morning, I left the house with only a backpack, my phone, and that envelope. I told Margaret I was going to work a shift. She barely glanced up. Sophia was still asleep, makeup smudged from the night before. Richard barked at the television. None of them noticed I walked out not as a daughter leaving for a few hours, but as a woman leaving forever. The apartment I rented was small, damp, and smelled of old paint, but when I closed the door behind me, my chest filled with something I had never felt in that house ownership. No one could barge in. No one could drag a rose branch across my skin. No one could tell me I was nothing. Determination expanded inside me until it felt larger than the walls. That night, I slept on the floor with only a thin blanket, but it was the best sleep of my life. From that point on, everything became sharper. I worked long hours, took on extra projects, and poured myself into my studies. I was exhausted but never empty. Every insult they had ever thrown at me became a mantra. Trash. Useless. Shadow. I repeated the words silently while pushing through assignments, while hauling boxes, while scrubbing floors. Each time I repeated them, I turned them into fuel proof that I was outgrowing the chains they tried to wrap around me. Determination also meant patience. I did not rush to confront them. I did not scream the truth to neighbors or post online. I let them believe their narrative while I quietly rewrote my own. When I returned to visit on rare weekends, I played the role they expected, nodding at Sophia's bragging, smiling faintly at Margaret's barbed remarks, enduring Richard's dismissals. They thought I was still trapped. They could not see the freedom waiting just beyond their vision. My determination crystallized one evening as I sat in my tiny apartment, stacks of books around me, the scar on my face catching the dim light. I realized I no longer wanted their approval. I wanted my own life built by my own hands. Their laughter was still in my ears, but now it sounded hollow. They did not know it yet, but every cruel word had backfired. Every wound they inflicted had turned into iron in my spine. Determination is not loud. It does not announce itself with shouting. It builds in secret, brick by brick, until one day it becomes unbreakable. That was what I was becoming, and though they still saw me as the girl beneath their feet, I knew in my bones I was already standing taller than all of them. Sophia's decline began quietly, like a crack in a perfect vase that no one notices at first. She still walked into rooms with the same arrogance, still tossed her hair as though the world should bow, but behind her eyes I started to see shadows. She had dropped out of college without telling most people, claiming she was taking a break to focus on modeling opportunities. In truth, she had failed more classes than she could recover from, too busy with parties and late-night adventures to keep up. Margaret defended her instantly, insisting Sophia was meant for bigger things than books, while Richard poured money into her lifestyle as if throwing dollar bills could keep her throne intact. Yet the cracks grew. Her friends, the ones who adored her glamour, began to peel away. Too many times she showed up drunk. Too many times she borrowed clothes without returning them. Too many times she promised rides or favors and then forgot. Whispers reached me through neighbors and even Jessica, who had overheard conversations at the store. People were calling Sophia unreliable. Some said she was a mess behind the polished photos she posted online. For the first time in years, the glow surrounding her began to dim, though Margaret and Richard refused to admit it. They clung to the illusion like it was oxygen. I watched from the sidelines with a quiet satisfaction I could not share with anyone. At work, I gained small promotions. At school, I earned certificates, while Sophia spiraled further. Each time I heard Margaret defending her, my satisfaction grew sharper. "She is destined for greatness," Margaret repeated, but the words sounded brittle now. Richard muttered about how young women always stumbled, but his eyes betrayed worry when he thought no one was watching. They could not stop the decline, no matter how many excuses they crafted. Sophia's social media became her lifeline. She posed in expensive dresses, smiling at parties, her captions filled with exaggerated tales of success. But the truth slipped through. Comments grew harsher. Friends unfollowed. She was chasing a fantasy that fewer people believed in. Meanwhile, I built quietly my reputation at work, spreading my supervisors, noticing my dedication. Jessica saw it too. One evening she said softly, "I think you are going to pass them all one day, Claire." I felt the truth in her words settle deep, feeding that subtle satisfaction. The more Sophia stumbled, the more desperate Margaret became. She insisted Sophia needed another chance, begged Richard to cover new debts, and scolded me for not supporting my sister enough. I listened silently, nodding pretending obedience, but inside I savored the irony. The daughter they called trash was holding her life together, while the daughter they worshipped was falling apart. It was not revenge, yet, not the grand moment I dreamed of, but it was the beginning. There were small humiliations for Sophia that the family tried to hide. Once, a company she applied to rejected her after the interview because she lacked basic qualifications. She stormed home furious, slamming doors, blaming everyone but herself. Margaret rushed to console her, claiming the company was blind, while Richard promised to call a friend to open another door. I overheard the conversation and felt that flicker of satisfaction again. They could try to polish her image forever, but cracks kept breaking through. Another time, she borrowed a large sum of money from Richard for what she claimed was a professional photo shoot. Instead, it went to cover debts from parties and shopping. When the truth came out, Richard yelled for the first time, his patience thinning. Yet even then, he ended up paying. Margaret scolded him for raising his voice, insisting Sophia was under stress. I stayed silent in the corner, watching the empire of favoritism falter brick by brick. Jessica became the one person I could share glimpses of this satisfaction with. I never told her the full story, but she saw the signs. She saw me working tirelessly while Sophia floundered. She noticed the shift in my posture, the way my silence carried new weight. She told me, "You have something they cannot take away." I clung to her words. For the first time, I felt like someone outside my family saw me not as a shadow, but as a force in the making. Subtle satisfaction is dangerous because it tempts you to celebrate too early. I reminded myself daily that this was only the beginning. Watching Sophia unravel gave me fuel, but I knew I needed patience. My plan required precision. Still, the sight of her stumbling where she once strutted filled me with a quiet joy I could not deny. I had been humiliated for so long, and now watching her taste failure was like water to my parched soul. The scar on my cheek was fading, though it remained visible. I would touch it sometimes when I heard her screaming at our parents for more money. The scar reminded me of what she had done, but it also reminded me of the power shift underway. She had given me this mark in triumph, but it had become a symbol of her decline and my rise. I whispered to myself, every downfall begins with arrogance. Hers has already begun. By the end of that year, the difference between us was undeniable. Sophia was unemployed, drowning in excuses while I was climbing step by step. Margaret and Richard still pretended she was destined for greatness, but their voices cracked when they said it. Neighbors began to notice too. I overheard one whisper, "Poor Claire, maybe she is the strong one after all." The words warmed me in a way I could not explain. Subtle satisfaction carried me through those months. It was not victory yet, but it was proof that the world could change, that the pedestal they had placed Sophia on was not eternal. And as I watched her stumble again and again, my determination only grew stronger. The day would come when the whole world, not just a few neighbors, would see the truth. Opportunity often arrives quietly wrapped in something ordinary. But when I look back, I realize the moment that changed everything began with a simple email. It was late in the evening. I was sitting in my small apartment surrounded by books and notes, my scar catching the glow of the desk lamp when the message appeared. Our company was opening applications for a leadership position on a high-profile project, a chance that could shift entire careers. My heart raced as I read the description, the requirements, the responsibilities. It was exactly what I had been working toward every long night and every extra shift feeding into this possibility. But I also knew tension came with it. For months, Sophia had been telling people she was waiting for a big break, some glamorous role or opportunity that would finally prove her greatness. When I saw the announcement, I knew instantly she would apply. The days that followed were heavy with anticipation. Sophia pranced around the house in borrowed business suits, pretending to be preparing for interviews, bragging loudly to Margaret and Richard about how she would impress executives with her charm. She told them beauty was enough, and they believed her, clapping at every word. Margaret said, "You will shine like you always do, darling." Richard promised they would be lucky to have you. Their certainty filled the air like smoke choking me whenever I visited. Yet beneath their blind faith, I felt something else brewing. This was the collision course we had been moving toward all our lives. I spent every spare minute working on my application. I detailed my certifications, my years of dedication, my proven results on smaller projects. I stayed up past midnight refining answers, practicing interviews in the mirror, whispering encouragement to my reflection. "You have earned this, Claire." The scar on my cheek stared back like a reminder of why I could not fail. Tension tightened in my chest with every passing day. This was not just a job. This was the stage where truth would finally separate from illusion. Jessica noticed my exhaustion at work and asked what I was pushing myself for. I hesitated before telling her about the opportunity. She listened intently, then nodded, her eyes bright with conviction. "This is yours, Claire, not because they owe it to you, but because you built yourself for it." Her faith steadied me even as my anxiety clawed at me. Sophia's arrogance grew louder. She boasted that executives would choose her instantly, that people always liked her. She laughed about how easy it would be, mocking the idea of anyone else standing a chance. Margaret helped her choose outfits Richard bragged to neighbors about his brilliant daughter. I stayed silent, watching the tension coiling tighter. They had no idea I was applying too. No idea that their scapegoat was stepping into the same arena. The day of the interviews arrived. I sat in the waiting room, my palms sweating, my heart pounding. Sophia walked in minutes later, her red dress bright, her perfume overwhelming. She saw me sitting there and froze, her smile cracked. "What are you doing here?" she hissed. I met her eyes steadily. "The same as you." "Competing." Her face twisted, disbelief flickering into fury. "You cannot be serious." But I was, and she saw it. For the first time, she saw me as a rival, not a shadow. The interviews were grueling, but I answered every question with clarity, drawing on real experiences, real results. Sophia tried to charm her way through tossing hair and flashing smiles, but I watched from across the room as some interviewers exchanged skeptical glances. Tension swirled inside me like a storm. I would not know the results that day, but I felt something shift. When the acceptance email came days later, I read it 3 times to believe it. "Claire Dawson, we are pleased to offer you the leadership role." My knees nearly gave out. I clutched the paper to my chest, the tension exploding into a strange mix of relief and anticipation. This was it. This was the key to the stage I had been waiting for. Sophia stormed through the house later that evening, screaming that the company was blind, that they did not recognize talent. Margaret rushed to comfort her. Richard shouted about injustice. None of them suspected the truth, that the offer had gone to me. I kept silent, hiding my victory like a secret weapon. Only Jessica knew, and she grinned when I told her. "This is your stage, Claire. Do not hold back." Her words echoed in my head every night as I prepared for what came next. Because this was not just about winning the position. This was about the moment when the whole world, including my family, would see the truth they had denied for years. Tension thickened as the date of the company's charity gala approached. It would be the event where the new project leader would be introduced to hundreds of influential guests, broadcast across the company's networks, celebrated in photographs and articles. I was that leader, and I decided then that I would invite my family, not to celebrate with me, but to witness. When I delivered the invitation, Sophia's laughter cut through the air. "Oh, Claire, how sweet, you want us there to watch you fetch drinks for the real executives." Margaret smirked, muttering something about how at least I was useful as an assistant. Richard chuckled, dismissing me before turning back to his television. None of them knew. None of them realized the trap they had already stepped into. The tension inside me was almost unbearable, a taut string pulled so tight it hummed. But I held it, patient, determined. On the night before the gala, I stood in my apartment staring at my reflection. The scar across my cheek had faded, but was still visible in the light. I traced it with my fingertip and whispered, "Tomorrow this scar will not be shame. It will be proof. Proof of everything I survived. Proof of everything I have become." The tension in my chest steadied into focus. Tomorrow their laughter would finally break. The night of the gala shimmered with the kind of polished perfection that could fool most people into believing life was only made of silk and chandeliers. The ballroom was vast, filled with golden light that spilled from crystal fixtures, music from a live orchestra humming like a promise beneath the voices of the crowd. Guests arrived in glittering gowns and tailored suits, their laughter bouncing against marble walls. For me, walking into that space was like stepping onto a stage I had been preparing for my entire life. I wore a simple black dress, elegant but modest, chosen not to dazzle but to command. The scar across my cheek was faint in the soft light, but I chose not to hide it completely. It was a part of me, and tonight it would bear witness. My family trailed behind me like royalty entering a palace. Margaret wrapped in diamonds, Richard in his finest suit, Sophia in a dress as red as blood. They carried themselves with smug assurance, convinced they were guests of honor, believing my invitation meant I had finally accepted my role as their shadow. Margaret whispered as we entered, "At least you managed to get us through these doors, Claire. Try not to embarrass us." I only nodded, my heart steady despite the storm beneath my ribs. The ballroom filled quickly, servers carrying trays of champagne, photographers capturing smiles, executives shaking hands. Everywhere I turned, I saw power, influence, and prestige. My parents drank it in like they belonged. Sophia preened under the gaze of strangers, her laugh too loud, her gestures too practiced. They did not know that tonight the script was not theirs. Tonight they were not the stars. Jessica found me near the entrance, her eyes warm, her smile genuine. She looked radiant in a navy gown, but what struck me most was her calm presence. "This is it," she whispered. "They will never forget what they see tonight." Her words settled inside me like steel. Together we moved through the crowd, greeting colleagues, exchanging polite words. My family watched confusion flickering in their eyes as more and more guests congratulated me. Not them. Margaret muttered to Richard, "Why are they speaking to her so much?" Richard frowned, but before he could answer, the music softened and the host of the evening stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight," he began, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "Tonight we celebrate not only generosity, but also resilience, innovation, and leadership." My pulse quickened. The air felt charged. The host continued, "And now it is my honor to introduce someone who embodies those qualities, someone who has proven that determination and vision can transform challenges into triumph. Please welcome to the stage our new project leader, Claire Dawson." The applause erupted like thunder, echoing against the high ceiling. For a moment, the sound blurred into light and heat, and I almost forgot to breathe. I stepped forward, the spotlight finding me, and the room seemed to tilt. Faces turned, cameras flashed, and in that sea of eyes, I saw the stunned expressions of my family. Margaret's mouth fell open, diamonds glittering against her pale skin. Richard froze, glass suspended in his hand. Sophia gasped audibly, her wine sloshing over the rim of her glass before it shattered against the marble floor. Jessica walked ahead of me, her heels clicking against the stage. She held the microphone with poise, her voice clear. "I have had the privilege of working alongside Claire," she said, "and I can tell you that her dedication is unmatched. I have seen her stay long nights to save projects, I have seen her turn obstacles into solutions, and I have seen her treat every challenge as a step forward. Tonight, she stands here not by accident, not by appearance, but by merit. Please join me in honoring my colleague and friend." Applause swelled again as she gestured to me. I took the stage, my legs steady despite the storm inside. The spotlight bathed me in light, erasing every shadow I had carried for years. I looked out across the audience past the executives and guests, straight into the faces of Margaret, Richard, and Sophia. Their eyes were wide, their confidence shattered. In that moment, I saw them for what they were: not gods, not rulers, not untouchable, just people small and trembling, clinging to illusions that had finally cracked. I gripped the microphone, my voice calm. "Thank you," I began. "I never believed I would be here standing before all of you. For a long time, I thought my place was silence. But silence, I've learned, is not weakness. It can be the ground where strength grows." The words were for the audience, but my eyes never left my family. Each syllable was a mirror, forcing them to see what they had created and what they had lost. I spoke of resilience of building a path despite obstacles, of how setbacks can become fuel. I did not name them, but every story I told was rooted in their cruelty. The audience nodded, applauded, cheered. But Margaret and Richard sat frozen, their faces stiff, their hands gripping the arms of their chairs. Sophia's painted grin had collapsed entirely, her eyes wide with disbelief. She looked as though she had fallen into a nightmare she could not wake from. When I finished, the applause rolled over me in waves. People stood clapping, cheering. Cameras flashed, capturing me in the glow of triumph. I whispered under my breath, words only I could hear. Trash can bloom brighter than roses. The scar on my cheek tingled under the lights as if it too was smiling. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations. Executives shook my hand. Guests praised my leadership colleagues, toasted to my success. Jessica stayed close, her presence grounding me. Every time I caught sight of my family, their faces grew darker, smaller, swallowed by the reality they could not deny. Neighbors from our town who had come to the gala looked at me with new respect, whispering among themselves. The girl they had once pitied, the one they ignored as Sophia flourished, was now the one standing in the spotlight. Margaret tried to compose herself, whispering to Richard in frantic tones, but nothing could mask the collapse. Richard drank glass after glass, his face tight with fury he could not display publicly. Sophia attempted to flirt with executives desperate to reclaim attention, but they brushed her off, politely drawn instead to the story of resilience standing in front of them. Every failed attempt chipped away at her confidence until she sat sulking, her red dress glaring like a wound. When the evening drew to a close, I walked down from the stage, the applause still echoing in my ears. I passed my family without pausing, their eyes following me in stunned silence. I could feel the weight of their disbelief pressing against my back, but it no longer mattered. I had carried their weight for years, and tonight I dropped it in front of the entire world. Outside the ballroom, the cool night air hit my skin, refreshing, liberating. Jessica joined me, her smile wide. "You did it, Claire. They saw everything." I nodded, my voice low but steady. They saw, and they will never unsee it. The tension that had wound itself around me for years snapped in that moment, releasing into something new. Not just relief, but triumph. Back inside, I knew they sat in silence, trapped in the echo of applause that was never theirs. For years, they had called me nothing, trash, shadow. Tonight, the world called me leader. Tonight, the applause belonged to me. The morning after the gala dawned, crisp and cool sunlight spilling through my apartment window in thin, golden lines. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the city stir awake, and felt a strange stillness inside me. The applause from the night before still echoed in my head, a roar that drowned out years of silence. For the first time in my life, the noise in my mind was not their laughter or their insults. It was the sound of people clapping for me. Yet even in that glow, a bittersweet heaviness lingered, a recognition that triumph always carries shadows. News of the gala spread quickly. Articles appeared online featuring photographs of me standing at the podium, the scar on my cheek faintly visible beneath the lights. Headlines praised my resilience, my leadership, my story. Colleagues sent messages of congratulations. Executives who had once passed me by now sought me out, offering opportunities. My inbox overflowed with invitations and acknowledgments. For once, my name stood on its own, not as an afterthought to Sophia's. At the grocery store, neighbors who had once looked through me now stopped to shake my hand. One older woman whispered, "We underestimated you." Claire and I nodded, a quiet smile on my face. It was satisfying, yes, but tinged with bitterness too. They had all seen me suffer for years and said nothing. Now that victory glimmered around me, they finally opened their eyes. I could not decide whether to accept their recognition or resent it. Perhaps both. Meanwhile, in the Dawson household, silence hung heavier than ever. Margaret could not spin the narrative this time, not when photographs of me filled news feeds and videos of my speech circulated online. Richard avoided questions from neighbors, his face tight, his words clipped. Sophia sulked, furious, her attempts to regain attention crumbling. She tried to post glamorous pictures after the gala, pretending to be the star of the evening, but comments beneath the photos betrayed the truth. People recognized her as the sister who had once been praised, but now stood in the shadow of the one she had tormented. The pedestal had cracked, and the fall was merciless. Jessica told me she overheard conversations at work. People were talking about Sophia not with admiration, but with pity or scorn. Some laughed at how far she had fallen. Others criticized my parents for their blindness. Every word was a reversal of the world I had known, and I absorbed it like a slow balm, letting years of wounds ease under its weight. Yet I also felt the sting of knowing it took public recognition to make anyone believe me. One evening, I visited the old neighborhood for the first time since the gala. As I walked past the fences that had once hidden neighbors' eyes, people looked at me differently. They nodded respectfully, some even waved. The same fences that had been barriers now felt like lines of surrender. I stopped for a moment outside my family's house, watching the dim light in the windows. I wondered what conversations echoed inside. Perhaps Margaret was pacing diamonds heavy on her neck, muttering excuses. Perhaps Richard was drowning in drink, cursing the world. Perhaps Sophia was screaming into her pillow, demanding a reality that no longer existed. Whatever it was, I knew their empire of cruelty was collapsing inward. Satisfaction warmed me, but it was not pure. There was a bitterness in realizing that nothing I did privately ever mattered to them. Only when the world validated me did the scales shift. I thought about the countless nights I cried alone, the mornings I woke with fresh bruises, the times I begged silently for mercy. Those moments had been invisible. Only now, with cameras and applause, did they fade into silence. It was justice, yes, but it was also late. Still, I could not deny the sweetness of their downfall. Invitations dried up for Sophia. Her name whispered with ridicule instead of praise. Margaret and Richard found doors closed to them in the community, their once proud presence diminished to awkward silences and cold stares. When I passed them at town events, they lowered their eyes or glared without words. They could not speak, not when the truth was so visible. And that silence was more satisfying than any apology could have been. Jessica reminded me one evening as we shared coffee. This time, the applause was yours, not theirs. I nodded, my eyes misting unexpectedly. She was right. The applause did not erase the years of humiliation, but it drowned them. For once, the sound that followed me into sleep was not Sophia's laughter, but clapping hands. It was strange how healing that could feel. The scar on my cheek remained faint, but undeniable. People sometimes asked about it, curious. I smiled and said only, "It is a reminder, leaving them to wonder." In truth, it was a banner proof of everything endured and overcome. Each time I touched it, satisfaction swelled, but so did a twinge of sorrow. It should never have existed, but since it did, I claimed it as mine. Bittersweet satisfaction carried me through those months. I had risen, I had claimed my stage, and they had fallen into the silence they once forced on me. Yet I knew the story was not only about victory, it was also about loss. The loss of family, the loss of years, the loss of innocence. Triumph came with scars, and not all of them were visible. Sometimes at night I still heard echoes of humiliation, still saw Sophia's smirk, still felt Margaret's cold eyes. But now those echoes were quieter, drowned by applause, by recognition, by my own steady breath. I whispered to myself, they cannot erase me anymore. I am written in places they cannot reach. In the end, satisfaction was not in their downfall alone, but in my survival. I had carried their cruelty for years, and now I carried proof of my strength. The balance had shifted forever, and though I would never forget, I finally knew how it felt to walk through the world unbowed. The months after the gala became a new chapter of my life, one I had once believed impossible. My apartment, small as it was, transformed into a sanctuary, a place that reflected only my choices, my silence, my strength. Each morning I woke to sunlight on my scarred cheek, and instead of shame, I felt pride. I touched the faint line with my fingers, remembering not just the pain of that night, but the promise I had whispered to myself in blood and tears. They thought they had cut me down, but they had marked the beginning of my rise. At work, my role as project leader blossomed into opportunity after opportunity. My team respected me not for my name or my appearance, but for the hours I invested, the clarity of my vision, the resilience that guided me. Every decision I made was rooted in lessons learned from years of dismissal, years of invisibility. I knew how to listen when others ignored. I knew how to persist when others gave up. And most importantly, I knew how to turn scars into strength. The applause from colleagues became a daily rhythm, not the deafening roar of the gala, but the steady hum of recognition earned through action. Sophia, meanwhile, struggled to re-enter the spotlight she once believed permanent. She tried different jobs, none lasting more than a few weeks. She posted heavily edited photographs online, but the comments no longer praised her beauty. They questioned her choices, compared her to me, sometimes cruelly. I did not gloat publicly, but privately I acknowledged the irony. The golden child had dimmed, and the shadow had become the light. Margaret and Richard withdrew into a bitter silence. Neighbors no longer greeted them with admiration. Invitations stopped arriving. They sat in their house, the same porch where Margaret had once clapped for Sophia's cruelty, but now no one came to watch. Their kingdom had crumbled into isolation. When I passed them at a local event months later, the sight was striking. Margaret's diamonds looked heavier, as though they weighed down her neck. Richard's posture had slumped, his eyes dull. Sophia stood between them, her red dress replaced with something plain, her confidence faded. They glared at me as if hoping their old power could return, but I only nodded politely and walked on. Their silence followed me like a ghost, but it no longer had claws. Jessica remained by my side through it all, her friendship a constant reminder that not everyone turned away. One evening as we shared dinner, she said quietly, "You changed everything, Claire. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who watched you rise." I smiled, the scar pulling slightly at the corner of my cheek. I told her they thought silence was defeat, but silence was my training ground. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. That line stayed with me for weeks. The scar itself became a symbol not just to me, but to others. When colleagues asked, I told them it was a reminder of what I had endured, though I spared them the details. They nodded understanding in their own way. Some whispered later that my strength came from battles no one could see. They were right. The scar had once been an emblem of humiliation, but now it was a badge of resilience, proof that even wounds can become armor. There were moments when bitterness resurfaced, when I remembered too clearly the years of neglect. The birthdays ignored the bruises hidden. Those memories could still sting, but they no longer defined me. They were chapters I had survived, and survival was its own kind of victory. I let the bitterness wash through me like rain, and when it passed, I was still standing. That I realized was power. Liberation came not in dramatic gestures, but in quiet mornings, in the freedom to breathe without fear, to plan my future without their voices dictating my worth. I filled my apartment with books, plants, small treasures of my choosing. I invited friends over, laughter filling the space where once silence had suffocated me. Each day felt like proof that I had escaped the cage they built. Yet pride was not only in escape, but in transformation. I had not simply left behind the girl they called trash. I had built someone stronger, someone who could walk into a room and command attention without shouting. I had become a woman who knew the value of persistence, the weight of scars, the strength of silence. Pride swelled in me when I looked back at the path I had carved, a path they had tried to erase. One evening, standing on the balcony of my apartment, I watched the city lights flicker like stars. The wind brushed against my face, cool and steady. I touched the scar again and whispered, "The day you slashed me with roses was the day you planted your own downfall." The words tasted like freedom, like closure. I knew then that I no longer needed their validation, their recognition, or even their apologies. I had outgrown the cage. Still, when I crossed paths with them again, months later, I felt no need for confrontation. They were already living the consequences of their choices. Sophia's beauty no longer shielded her Margaret's cold charm, no longer commanded a crowd. Richard's authority no longer mattered. They had created a kingdom built on cruelty, and it had collapsed under its own weight. My victory was not in shouting at them, but in walking past them with my head high, my scar gleaming under the sun. The community saw the shift too. Neighbors who once turned away now spoke openly about the favoritism, the cruelty. They admitted they had been blind. Some apologized in quiet tones. I accepted their words with grace, but carried the knowledge that their silence had cost me years of pain. Still, forgiveness was less for them and more for me. Carrying resentment forever would only tether me to the past. Letting it go was another form of liberation. As time passed, I built more than a career. I built a life filled with choice and dignity. I traveled. I met new people. I allowed myself to dream in ways I had never dared before. The scar remained, but instead of hiding it, I wore it proudly. In photographs, it caught the light. In conversations, it reminded me of how far I had come. It was not a flaw, but a story written on my skin. The night of the gala had been the climax, but the true victory was ongoing. Each day I lived free was a continuation of the applause, a rhythm that no longer required an audience. Liberation was steady. Pride was quiet but unshakable. I had transformed their cruelty into my triumph, their laughter into my fuel, their silence into my stage. Standing once more on my balcony, the city alive beneath me, I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. I was no longer the shadow, no longer the scapegoat. I was Claire Dawson, and I had bloomed brighter than the roses meant to cut me. Looking back now, I realized the story of my life was never about roses or scars, not really. It was about silence and what you choose to do with it. For years, my silence was used against me, painted as weakness, shaped into proof that I was nothing. But in the end, silence became my strongest weapon. It allowed me to observe, to learn to build, and finally to strike with precision. My family wanted me erased, hidden behind Sophia's glow, trapped under Margaret's scorn and Richard's indifference. They thought they had written my story. What they never realized was that I was writing it all along, line by line, even in the darkest corners of that attic room. The scar on my cheek will always be with me. Sometimes I still trace it in the mirror and remember the sting of the branch, the laughter that followed the humiliation that once buried me. But now it no longer feels like shame. It feels like a medal I earned in the quietest war of my life. A reminder that pain can be transformed into power if you refuse to let it define you. When people ask about it, I simply smile and say, "It is my reminder, nothing more, nothing less." Because it is not a wound anymore, it is a symbol. I often wonder if Margaret or Richard ever lie awake at night thinking about what they did. I wonder if Sophia stares at herself in the mirror, wondering where it all went wrong. But the truth is, their thoughts no longer matter to me. For so long, I lived under their voices, every word shaping my sense of self. Now I live under my own. And that shift, that quiet liberation, is the greatest victory of all. Their downfall was never my true goal. My goal was to stand free, to breathe without fear, to know my worth without needing anyone to hand it to me. And I have done that. Still, I carry the lessons with me. Cruelty can disguise itself as love. Favoritism can poison families, and silence can be dangerous if it is forced. But I also know resilience can be forged in the harshest conditions. I know that scars can tell stories stronger than any smile, and I know that justice does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes slowly, steadily, until one day the balance shifts and the applause is finally yours. For those who have lived in shadows like mine, I want you to hear this. You are not defined by the cruelty of others. You are not the names they call you, not the dismissals they throw your way. You are what you choose to become in spite of it. I was called trash. I was told I would never bloom. Yet here I stand, blooming brighter than the roses meant to destroy me. If I can rise, so can you. Even now, when I walk into rooms, people sometimes glance at my scar. I let them. Let them wonder. Let them question. Let them see it. Because behind that line etched into my skin is an entire story of survival, of transformation, of triumph. It is mine, and I carry it with pride. When I think about the girl I once was sitting in her attic room with an envelope of hidden cash and a notebook filled with silent vows, I want to tell her, hold on. The day will come when the silence will break, when the world will see you, when your scar will shine in the light instead of hiding in the dark. That day did come, and it came because she never gave up even when every voice told her to. I do not know what the future holds. None of us do. But I know this. I will face it with the same determination that carried me here. I will face it with the scar that reminds me who I am. And I will face it with the knowledge that no matter how dark the shadow's light can still rise. So when you hear my story, I hope you take with you more than just the details of cruelty or revenge. I hope you take with you the reminder that strength can be quiet, resilience can be invisible, and justice can arrive even when you least expect it. Do not let anyone convince you that you are worthless. Do not let anyone steal your voice forever. Your silence, if you choose, can become your most powerful roar. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever felt dismissed, overlooked, or erased, know that you are not alone. And know that the ending does not have to belong to them. It can belong to you. Please subscribe to this channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from and tell us what scars you have turned into strength. Because every scar holds a story and every story has the power to bloom.